I'm Valkyrie. I'm going to be talking about 3D printing the best game controller, a teeny tiny story about my life. I'm originally from the US. I did my undergrad in Indiana. I studied abroad because I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And then I came back to the US to do my PhD. My thesis had an incredibly boring title, but we are going to talk about some things from it, so I'm going to read it to you. Fabbed to Sense, Integrated Design of Geometry and Sensing for Interactive Objects. What does that mean? We're going to find out. After that, my partner and I decided we actually wanted to live in Canada, so we moved there, did some educational games startup, and I didn't actually like that either, so I went and worked for somebody else's startup. And now I work here in Copenhagen as an assistant professor. Other than work, I do a thing called Jugger, which I think there will be a talk about here in a few weeks. I advocate for cycling infrastructure, which is not as big of a problem in Denmark as it was in Canada or the US. I brew beer, I love playing video games, and yes, my name really is Valkyrie Savage. So here's, according to Anna's formula, I'm supposed to shock you with something that you probably know, which is that 51% of Danes over 16 play video games, which I just think is amazing. This is a study by Statistics Denmark from 2018, and we all know that COVID made it an even higher number, but 25% of those people actually play video games every day, which I think is incredible. So that's 15 or so of you playing games every day. I love it. So since statistically all of you play video games, or at least a lot, I want somebody to tell me which one is the best video game controller. GameCube. Atari. What?
The arcade for the Amiga 500.
The arcade for the Amiga 500, okay. Xbox One. Okay, there's a lot of opinions here. Some of them are very interesting, and I want to know more about a few of you, but lots of opinions, okay. So maybe instead, can we agree on what makes a great video game controller, since we don't know what the best one is? What's something that makes a video game controller great? The
tactile part as well.
The tactile part, okay, yep.
Not a glove.
Not
The glove.
Not the glove. Okay, yeah, no, that's totally fair. Ergonomics, okay. Anything else?
Buttons.
Buttons. I love buttons. That's actually a very good answer, and it helps me with the rest of my talk, so thank you. So when I thought about this, I was like, what are some of the things that make a great video game controller? There's the shape, the ergonomics, as I heard somebody shout. There's the theme. So for example, I don't know if any of you played Dance Dance Revolution or something like that, but it makes a little less sense. It makes a little less sense to play that on like a Guitar Hero controller, for example. There's the forces. So I got haptic feedback. That was one of the keywords that was shouted. And then there's the interactions, like what do we actually do with this controller? You know, whether they're button presses or motion controls or whatever, do they make sense for what I'm actually doing? But today I'm actually going to talk about shape and buttons. So as we maybe learned from the shouting, what makes the best game controller is actually different for everybody and for every different task that you do. So I didn't actually hear in this group a single person that shouted two different controllers, but you may have two different favorite controllers depending on how many different kinds of games you play. Some of them have different controllers that you like to use. So you don't necessarily want the same thing for everything you do, and the person next to you evidently has a very different opinion from yours. But manufacturing for game controllers happens on this huge scale. So while each company, like Nintendo or Atari, makes their own game controller, every Nintendo controller that you play with is the same, every PlayStation controller is the same, and they're optimized to the population that buys the most of them, which statistically is men 18 to 24 years old. How can we do better than that? As I thought about in the talk title, I see 3D printing as a way to overcome this. And I think this is true for a lot of reasons. So one obvious one is that each object that comes out of a 3D printer, can be unique. So we don't have to make 1,000 controllers that are all exactly the same. But the really interesting thing is that every physical object that we get has a digital version before we get the physical one. So as a computer scientist, I'm very comfortable with manipulating digital data. The physical world is a little bit of a mystery to me. But if the printer takes the digital stuff and turns it into physical stuff, then I actually have control over the real world. Very satisfying. So we can print a bunch of controllers, and we can control some things about them. Each one can be different, but they're just plastic. So one of the most popular things that I see people 3D printing is not humans, it's vases, which are very nice, but they're not game controllers. So how can we print functional game controllers? How do we make them work? We're going to use this idea that they have the digital twin. So with our digital model, we can include, for example, simple measurements. So this is actually my husband's wedding ring. And I measured his finger to make sure that it was going to fit before I printed it. Finger? Yes. Yes, his finger. It's his wedding hula hoop. So we can include simple measurements to make sure that a ring will fit on a finger, or we can do more complicated simulations. So from this design for a clock, we can simulate that it's going to work when it's printed, that it'll keep time correctly, that all the gears will mesh together, et cetera, et cetera. And all of this is stuff we can do without having the physical one. We just need the digital one to do this. So I could talk for a really long time about this. The sort of impenetrable title that I read you of my thesis was all about this. So what we looked at was simulating objects in order to make it easier to sense interactions with them. So interactive objects, in this case, I had in mind video game controllers. So for example, in this project, we built a tool where you model a 3D video game controller, and then that boxy thing that you put on the back is a virtual model of a physical camera. So here we see this is going to be our camera. This is the field of view of the camera, this like sort of square coney thing. And these are all of the buttons that we need to use for the controller. So we've got a little joystick, we've got a little D-pad, we've got some bumpers, and we've got some things around the back. And we can simulate what the camera can see. So in this case, it's pretty clear. The camera's in the back, it's looking forward, so it can see those two green ones. It can't see the red ones. Based on the simulation, we can actually modify the controller so that we can make the simulation better. So here, we stretched these two out, so they're now in the field of view of the camera. And these weird lines are the ray tracing of what the camera can see. So if we put mirrors in these two spots, basically the camera will see rays that bounce here and then bounce back to these red buttons in the back. And the idea here is that as we manipulate all these different components, they do stuff. So they move in the controller. When we push a button, we move it from one place to another. That's what pushing does. When we slide a slider, it has one end and a second end, and it's somewhere in between those two ends. The scroll wheel, as we scroll it, it moves, in one direction, etc., similar with all the other ones. But we can decode these motions. So here you can see this is the backside of a direction pad. And based on the way that these white blobs are moving, we can tell what the user's doing on the outside. So in the end, we can print these objects out, and up here in the right side, you can see the feed from our camera as I'm moving around the joystick in the bottom here. We made a DJ controller with these twistable knobs. Essentially, once you put the camera inside, it can see all the stuff, because we used this digital model and modified it so that we can sense it better. So we have plastic stuff, but now we have some ideas for how to make it functional as it comes out of the 3D printer. We can use this digital piece to simulate things and modify geometry to make it work with sensing. But there's still kind of a lot of questions here. So before we have this controller, how do we know that it's actually even going to be useful? And after we have the controller, is there any way that we can adjust it? how can we take something that has come out of the printer and maybe I like it a lot, but I want to hand it to that guy, and I don't know what he's going to like, so he needs to be able to fix it so that it's better for him. So let's think about how we can make useful shapes here. Figuring out how to automatically design interfaces has kind of been looked at for software. So this is a old research project that we talk about a lot in my HCI classes. But the idea is that here we can sort of simulate how humans see interfaces and how our fingers work and all of these things, so we can make an optimal interface. So here you see eye movements, and this is preparing for eye movements. And then there's some measurements that we can make based on how the average human interacts with a software interface. I'm really interested in how we can do this kind of optimization with a physical interface. So not just something that's on a screen, not just focused on eye movements, but focused on these manipulations and grasps of the physical stuff in our hands. And if we remember what we said before, what makes the best controller is different for every person and task. So while we all have very similar cognitive models, our physical bodies are kind of different. So in terms of being different for every person, this is two different people holding the same Sony controller. And you can see that just based on their hand size, the way in which they have to hold it to reach all of the buttons differs a lot. So the person on the left with bigger hands has an easier time of reaching all the buttons with sort of a lower grasp than the person on the right. But in addition to the static size of our hands, they also move different. So I don't know about you all, but I've broken a couple of my fingers before, so they don't really bend exactly the same way as all my other ones. If you play guitar, for example, you may have more dexterity in your fingers than regular people, but we all have these dynamic movements that differ from one person to the next. There are ways that people measure this, especially in physiotherapy. They use essentially fancy biomechanical protractors. You can see those up on the right. But now I think we have cooler ways that we could measure this. So this is from the Leap Motion. I don't know if any of you have played with that. It's sort of a depth camera that sits on your desk. Now they mount them on headsets too, and it looks at your hands and it sort of reconstructs what it is that your hands are doing. It enables this like real-time sort of interaction with the structure of your hands and their motion. And I think, and there are even fancier versions of basically the Leap Motion that can give you sub-millimeter accuracies. So the way that we could measure this is fairly obvious. What is useful to measure is kind of a different question, and it will require more thinking to figure out, what goes into a grasp of these kinds of game controllers. And then in terms of it being different for every task, I have put 3 keyboards here that represent heat maps of different games. So do any of you have guesses for the games here? When I say different games, I mean each of these represents like roughly an hour of a person playing a particular game. Can you guess what games they are based on these heat maps? I have one guess.
Counter-Strike on the right, up somewhere, yeah, that's Counter-Strike.
Okay, yeah, that is Counter-Strike. Very good. Which one's World of Warcraft?
The left one.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. What makes you think it's World of Warcraft?
Is that W, the one on the top?
Yeah, so that's WASD. Okay, so we have a guess for World of Warcraft. I think I saw a hand over here. No. An unsure hand, yeah. League of Legends at the bottom.
StarCraft at the bottom.
StarCraft at the bottom. Okay. What,
It's a video game.
It is a video game, yes. So this is the answers. You picked all the right games. But the point is, you all had some idea based on like just these keys, right? So in some of these games, you use WASD to move. In some of these games, you use lots of different keys to chat, or you use hot buttons to select particular units, or whatever the case may be. But the point is that the differences in these games are measurable. So we can tell these different kinds of games apart by looking at their sort of fingerprints. But the other interesting thing is that maybe I play these games different than you play these games. So maybe I'm the kind of character who really needs to access the sprint button all the time because I'm dashing away from danger, but you're probably braver than I am, so you're always using fireball or sword swing or whatever the case may be. And so that difference is also measurable. So you can measure a person's hands, you can measure the game they're playing, and you can measure how they play it. And so returning to our question, I think that by taking these kinds of measurements, we can sort of optimize our controllers. So we don't just have to take a single model of a controller that fits everybody, but we can take a generic model of a controller and sort of optimize it based on these measured play styles and people. It's essentially constraint satisfaction. To be clear, some of this stuff is things I'm still working on and thinking about. I don't have a complete answer here yet. I'm just excited about this measurement. Okay, so back to the list. We talked about how we can make them functional. We talked about how we could make them useful automatically by these measurements and optimization. But then there's still the question of how we can adjust them after they've been made. So the magical part about 3D printing, as I mentioned, is that we can kind of do simulations on an object before we print it. We have a virtual model, which we can guarantee some things about. For example, that this camera can see the things, inside, or that it could fit my hands or your hands exactly right, or that it's laid out perfectly to play StarCraft. And then we get an exact physical replica of whatever it is that we've optimized, which is awesome. But once we print the object, it's totally unlinked to the physical and digital models are totally unlinked. And that's not good. So if I print my controller and test it out and suddenly realize that it would be a little bit more comfortable if maybe it was a little bit wider from side to side, or maybe I want the grip to be a little bit different because I tend to play and when I'm making pizza and my hands are saucy, or I need better grip, or I don't know. But maybe I need it to be different in different situations. Or if I want to hand it to you, but you've got bigger hands than I do, then I could make those adjustments to the physical controller. It's just plastic after all. I could carve it or add Play-Doh to it or whatever the case may be. Some of those adjustments, like splitting it in half and pulling it apart, would be a little bit tricky. But whatever modifications I do, they won't be reflected back into the virtual model. So the physical model is something totally separate now. And if I wanted to make a copy of something I did to my physical controller, it would then be difficult. I'd have to do all these measurements with my calipers and figure out how to put it back. In addition, depending on how the thing is made, it might not work with my sensing anymore. So in the thing I showed you with the camera pointing inside, essentially once we stretch it out and do all of this stuff, there's no guarantees that the camera can see everything that's going on anymore. So we have a few problems. We need to keep the physical and virtual changes in sync, and we need to make sure that it keeps working. In terms of keeping it in sync, we could always 3D scan it. This is a little bit tedious. These programs are not as good as anybody wants them to be, and you have to do a lot of alignment in order to get them to work. The thing that I'm thinking more about is like dress forms. So these kind of do continuous modifications in order to fit particular bodies. So this sort of continuous modification where she can twist the dials and make it just a little bit bigger so that it fits the right person, I think is a really interesting idea. And we actually have some ways to print gears with 3D printers. So I've started sort of testing this idea. And the way it generally works is we have a gear with a couple of racks, and as we twist it, the racks get farther apart. And if we twist it the other way, the racks get closer together. So, of course, we then have to measure how far apart are those two things. We need to know how much we've twisted this and how big we've made it. So I loaded some conductive plastic into the 3D printer at work, which is basically just plastic with like some graphite in it so that an electric current can run through. And the idea is that if there's a shorter distance between the 2 points that I'm measuring, I'll see more signal between them. So this was sort of my first try at measuring, and I know it's kind of fuzzy, but the point is you can see the numbers changing as I squish them closer together. So this is sort of an idea of where one thing I'm exploring in terms of getting this continuous measurement so that you can adjust this purely plastic stuff after it's printed. And of course you can imagine the application here. You can stretch the game controller out, you can shrink the game controller back. It's also interesting to think about what this middle part does look like in the end. Is it just a square? Does it use some like creative cloud type content-aware fill? I don't know what content-aware fill looks like on a game controller, but it's interesting to think about. Similar to the dress form, another example of an object that allows modification while you're using it is Lego. This is different from the dress form though in that it doesn't allow continuous modification. You're actually swapping out discrete parts. I have been thinking a lot about how you can do this kind of discrete modification with 3D printed parts in terms of embedding magnets. So we actually have 3D printable magnetic materials as well, which has been a lot of fun to play with. And I know I'm slightly long on this talk, but I'll finish up very soon.
It's fine.
The other question, so there's how can we modify this device, and then how can we make sure it continues to work? So in terms of the sensing, there's kind of a couple of ways we could go about it. One way is really long wires. So if we just put really long wires inside this thing, it doesn't matter how much we stretch it out or shrink it. Basically, we've made something that's robust to this physical change. Another thing we could do is machine learning. So if you can imagine filling the entire inside of the game controller with mirrors, and then somehow the light is going to get everywhere and the camera is going to see everything, and it's not going to make any sense, but the machine will figure it out. The final idea is to take the sensing out of the game controller entirely. So why should we have it inside the controller when we could instead have it in the ceiling or on our bodies? So a project that I'm going to talk about very briefly looks at this external sensing. So we could have the thing on the device, we could have the thing on the interface. I'm not even going to mention that. Or we could put the thing on the human. So can we sense what the human is doing from the human body itself? We've got all this stuff in our arms that does things. So all of this gray is muscles. We've got bones. The yellow is nerves. The red is arteries. Of course, there's skin. There's fat. There's all kinds of good stuff. The orange is tendons that moves as we move stuff. So when I push the button on my video game controller, I'm exerting a force. And that transfers through my muscles, through my tendons, in my hand, but also up into my arm. And there's tons of these like electrical signals and mechanical signals that communicate what I'm doing. This is a wristband that I worked on in Toronto, and what it's looking at is actually the depth map of your tendons at the curve of your wrist here. And it can tell what you're doing, whether you're interacting with an external object, what shape your hand is in, based on the shape of those tendons. So we sort of built this system where you can record your interactions with objects. Here you can see I'm going to use a sriracha bottle. This is sort of what the depth map looks like, is this heat map situation. We do some magical machine learning stuff. And then afterwards, when I want to use my object, I basically tell the computer I'm going to start. It looks at the shape of my hand and figures out what I'm interacting with, whether it's squeezing a sponge or twisting this bottle. And then up in the upper right, you can see it's detecting how far I have twisted it along its path. So just by looking at these parts of our body, we can actually sense our interactions with stuff that has no electronics in it. Yeah, so I can use, my box cutter as a slider, or I can use my yeast jar lid, very difficult to find during COVID, as a dial. So almost anything can be digitized using your hand as the sensor here. So of course, instead of a water bottle or a sriracha bottle, I could use a real video game controller. The next thing I really want to try is putting this wristband on people as they interact with these plastic controllers, because it should look the same from the perspective of the sensor, whether the thing has been stretched out or cut up or whatever the case may be. So returning to this once more, we've talked about how to print controllers, how we can make them useful before we make them, and how we can adjust them after they've been made. And of course, I'm being slightly facetious in this talk because we don't only have to use this for video game controllers. We can use it for musical instruments. We can use it for surgical tools. Really anything that your hands need to interact with can benefit from these kinds of like personalization and shaping. So the big sort of thing that I'm thinking about here in Denmark is that I want these devices to be functional, modifiable, and linked between the physical and digital copies throughout the whole design process. And that is all. Thank you. Yeah.
In the first picture you showed an FDM printer. Are you only working with FDM or?
I almost exclusively use FDM because it's, to me, it's more interesting to make something that like a consumer could eventually use. And I think that like, while there is some consumer penetration of like SLA, it's not nearly at the level of FDM yet, so, yeah. For everybody who doesn't speak 3D printer, FDM is like when you take a tube of toothpaste and draw an object with it, and there's lots of other ways to make 3D objects, like powder, and a laser can draw the object, basically melt the powder together, or you can have goo and you shine a special light at it, and the special light like cures the object out of the goo and all this different stuff. But I like the toothpaste ones. They're the simplest to work with. Yeah.
Well, the question is that does the controller get smooth enough for that? I mean, I use a resin printer, and my understanding is just that an FDM printer, it doesn't get smooth enough, but I don't work on FDM.
It depends. So there is post-processing you can do to get rid of that layeriness, but also, I mean, the height of layers now is pretty small. I mean, it's like a 0.1 millimeter kind of, so it depends on your taste. Yeah.
You may want to add coating on it, because otherwise it gets really filthy really quickly.
That is also true. The comment was that 3D printed things get filthy with the ridges if you don't coat them. And yes, that is definitely true. I have many filthy, useless plastic things on my desk at work. I can tell you that.
What about the lifetime of 3D printed device compared to a board controller?
The lifetime of a 3D printed device. So, I mean, I think, well, okay. It's probably not as long, to be clear. However, it is much easier to recycle because it's all plastic as opposed to like mixed plastic and electronics. And so basically when it's not good anymore, you can just make a brand new one. And it's probably still slightly better for the earth than getting a new PlayStation controller over and over. But yes, definitely that is something to think about, is like the fact that these don't last the same amount as like injection molded parts. All right. Yeah, another question.
Did you understand correctly? You don't use any electronics in the controller?
The way I like to do it is with one sensor. So I talked sort of about using one camera. I've also done it with one microphone or like one capacitive pad or whatever. Like essentially having one thing that you can like easily remove is much easier to deal with versus like you have this like shell and then you like solder all this junk and like smash it in there, and it's easier for prototyping and iteration.
What about one day mass production? Would that be the same? Or?
I don't think you want to mass produce them. I think I want to make my own controller and you want to make your own controller and she wants to make her own controller. But yeah. Yeah.
And you were talking about the music instruments.
Yeah.
Yeah. How's that, like, what do you mean about that?
So I think it's interesting to think about how you could adjust a musical instrument to fit your own hands or you know, play style or whatever the case may be, or even just invent something totally new. Because the slide that I have here, this